Welcome to this seminar on Freudian Marxism and the social bond. I'm Daniel Tutt, very happy to welcome everyone here. I would say good morning, but I think this is global, so folks are all over, and it may be afternoon. If you haven't received the readings or access to the Google folder where the readings are, just let me know. Very, very honored to be back with GCAS in GCAS's first iteration a few years back. I was a pretty central player, and so I took a bit of a hibernation with GCAS, and I'm now happy to be back. I'm teaching this class because I've worked on Freudian Marxism for the past 15 years. And my objective in this class is to introduce some new perspectives on Freudian Marxism, which I hope will shake up our common understanding of this grand wager that Freud and Marx must be thought together. It's a wager which is met with a lot of hostility at times. It is sorry, hold on. The proposal that Freudian Marxism must be thought obviously comes from Marxists. It does not come from Freudians. Why? Because it's not immediately apparent that a psychoanalyst would have any interest in the revolution of bourgeois society. It's not necessary to be a psychoanalyst. So you could say the provocation is coming from the side of the Marxists. And of course, you can say also that the Freudians will naturally throw up some defenses to this suggestion, right? That's something we're going to look at right today, actually, by looking at the very interesting school started by Klaus Holtzkampf, the German, what's called Marxist or critical psychology, right? Which is in some sense died in the 1990s, but emerged in the 60s and 70s, right as Freudian Marxism in its very libertine bent was blossoming after Frankfurt School. These German schools of critical psychologists or Marxist psychology were saying, no, there are theoretical stumbling blocks to your attempted fusion of the Freudian system of truths or the Freudian set of concepts, right? So we're going to look at that, and we're going to also today look at Wilhelm Reich, who is, as you probably know, somebody that actually has had a profound influence on popular culture. We would not have the Hollywood motif of the Doctor of Love in the VW bus cruising around and giving pleasure to the consumer society if it were not for Wilhelm Reich, who in fact did that in the interwar period, right? And psychoanalysis after the First World War itself was faced with a profound question regarding communism, regarding Bolshevism, regarding the dictatorship of the proletariat, right? And as we will see in this course, Freud is forced to confront Marxism. He's forced to confront socialism. He's forced to, as a Jewish scientist who faced profound ostracization, we will see even in his break with Jung, in the background is a question of communism, is the question of Marxism, I wish to say. And I have some reason for that. In other words, what I'm trying to say to you is that even in Freud's thought, one cannot extricate the question of Marxism in the development of his concepts. That's, I think, very, very important, because if we are committed to Marxism, we have to contextualize the development of any concept of thought in a historical materialist fashion, right? So that's kind of one of my goals for this class, is to do that. As a format, my intention is to talk for 45 minutes, an hour, and then to open it. So questions can come while I'm talking, that's no problem. However, I will pose questions, and I have created some slides to assist us. I don't like PowerPoint, but I've done so only for your benefit so that you can take notes, because it's also important to say that I've given you an exorbitant amount of reading for 1 month of seminars. So naturally, I don't intend for all of us to read all of it. This is material that I have read before, and I'm rereading with you now. But it's also material which I flag as extremely significant, right? So it's something you should read beyond this class, after this class, as much as you can during this class. I've also thrown a large folder of optional readings, which I will reference. I will reference texts which we will try to summarize, and maybe in some cases not dig into the particulars, such as, let's say, Anti-Oedipus by Deleuze and Guattari. Incredibly difficult work. We need to get at it a little bit. So there will be texts, or Norman O'Brown's Life Against Death. Of course, we can have a whole seminar just on these texts, yeah, and we should. But my objective is to start at a slightly higher landscape to sort of dig into and identify some problems with this notion of Freudian Marxism. Now, so today is my objective is to start with this big picture. The next 3 sessions, we will focus on Freud's group psychology and the question of the social bond. So it's very important for the next section, the next week, that we are familiar with at least some elements of Freud's mass psychology and analysis of the ego, for which I've flagged in the syllabus the sections I wish for us to consider. The secondary literature on Freud's mass psychology and his theory of groups is immense. Every psychoanalyst tends to have their own reading precisely of what Freud is up to in this text. In fact, you could say that it presents the #1, I would argue, stumbling block regarding the question as to whether Freudian truths are compatible with a Marxist revolutionary vision or not. So much is hinged on this question, I would say. Not only the question of the patriarchal basis of Freud's commitments, which you could see as idiosyncratic, his insistence on the Oedipus complex as the resolution, or his insistence somehow that the love of the father be the bond of the group. How do you read these proposals? Can these proposals square with a socialist, feminist, or a Marxist orientation? Therefore, can you read Freud against the grain? Can you read Freud with Marxist intentions? So in this regard, we're going to look at some authors who point in radically opposite directions. And I will be sharing with you the perspective, which I am going to champion, of a newly translated work by an Argentinian Marxist Freudian scholar, Leon Rosichner, for which I've written a review of his book called Freud and Limits of Bourgeois Individualism, which provides us with what I consider to be the best, by far the best, and the most surprising, and the most distinct, and the most different argument about how to read Freud through Marxist lens. Very different than Herbert Marcuse, very different than Frankfurt School, very different than Deleuze and Guattari, very different than libertine psychoanalytic interpreters. Why? Well, because all of the problems of patriarchy, familialism, etc., he resolves these issues in some sense. And he brings back the proposal of Wilhelm Reich that in fact, Freud can be read almost in a classical Marxist sense, which we're going to talk about in a moment. What I mean by classical Marxist sense. So it's a very provocative thesis. No one has touched the book recently, although people should. Especially Lacanians should touch this book, should consider this book, should read this book, should try to critically analyze this book carefully. It's very long, but it's very readable. So I've given you excerpts of this book to read. Of course, my suggestion is to read the whole thing, for which you're going to have to find a hard copy because it's very painful to the eyes to read that much, naturally. My recommendation, if you wish for a hard copy and you can't afford it, is to ask for a review copy, which I always tell students, because often students forget that they can get review copies. You can get review copies, right? Anyways, let me put up my slides and just say I'm very excited to be with you. I hope that the plan sounds good. Let me know if there's any questions at this point, and if not, I will begin.
Just a quick question, Daniel. Can we access PDFs somewhere, or I guess? Oh, sorry.
Of course.
Thank you.
Let me share the link now, my friend.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so I'm going to copy this link, and then what's going to happen is if you don't have access, you click on that link. You just press request access, and then I should be able to grant. But all the PDFs are in there, organized by day. Look at the page numbers to read, because I've given the full text. I don't like it when you give a text where you cut out everything else in the book and you just focus on the page numbers to read. Precisely because if you're so interested in the text, you might want to go back and read the whole thing. Yeah. So, like, for example, when we look in the third session on Ernst Bloch's principle of hope and his very, very important notion of the not yet conscious, which is a Freudian concept in some sense, which situates Bloch's entire notion of how Marxist revolutionary history ought to be read. I've given you the whole text, right? Same with Norman O'Brown's, in my opinion, book, Life Against Death, which is never read much these days, but which is a super interesting and important work. So I'm giving you the whole thing. Okay, cool. Again, I'm so excited for this activity that we're doing here. Okay, here we are. Okay. All right. So our readings today are going to be considering the following three. Reich's dialectic of the psyche, which is incorporated in this collection from Verso called Sexball. And this is a brilliant set of essays focusing precisely on what's called the younger Wilhelm Reich's writings. Yeah. Again, who is Reich? He is a close, brilliant disciple of Freud, who was radicalized towards communism in Vienna. And there's a great biographical detail regarding his radicalization. He was once a witness to a protest, actually, in which the police actually shot and killed these kind of socialist agitators. And he saw this firsthand. And it was one of the catalyzing events. The other catalyzing event, of course, is what makes him so interesting, almost similar to Herman Melville, is his own contradictory class experience, which is precisely Wilhelm Reich was born from an aristocratic family, but grew up highly pauperized. Thirdly, he experienced some degree of incest within his own family. So you can see naturally that Reich is going to be drawn to Freudian field, but with a very interesting commitment to revolutionary socialism. He's known as somebody who was a rebel. Freud loved him. I mean, if you see the pictures of Freud's inner circle, and I think there was 7 or 8 disciples. Reich is one of them. So he received one of Freud's rings as a symbol of his inclusion in the inner circle. But Reich advocated a theory of the transference, which got him into quite a lot of trouble because it was a very whereas Ferenczi would push towards a conception of the transference that would focus on the non-relation between the analyst and the analysand, a kind of cold barrier, in some sense. Reich sought to bring a profoundly relational and warm theory of transference, for which it's said that he had many sexual escapades with his patients, right? So, and then of course, the important thing to note is that in his later work, he was persecuted by the state and ended up adopting what many think are kind of a cockamamie conception of libido and the organ accumulator. He was there's actually a Wilhelm Reich museum, I think in Maine, which I haven't seen. I don't know if anyone has been there yet. Anyways, very important. Holtzkamp, I've mentioned, a critical figure who I think died early 2000s of critical psychology. We're going to start with his reflections. Offers a kind of skeptical rebuttal of Freudianism for Marxism precisely. And then thirdly, we're going to consider a recent essay by Endnotes to introduce us to the concept of group psychology before we get to Freud, of Wilfred Bion's theory of groups. So we're going to conclude with that, and then we'll just open it up for comments and questions. So Holtzkamp tells us that, in fact, psychoanalysis is concerned with the main concerns of classical psychology, but is not concerned with a functionalist or a behavioralist approach to psychology. And he makes the interesting point, which you may have noticed if you read the essay, which is, you wouldn't have a Marxist behavioralist attempted fusion. So the question is sort of, what is it about psychoanalysis precisely that makes it relevant to Marxism, just from a kind of principle level? And here you can see he argues precisely that it is concerned with the problem of immediate experience, right? And it is in line with what he calls classical psychology. But to continue, he says, psychoanalysis is different than classical psychology because it seeks to move beyond individual experience and couch a structuralist understanding that links the individual to the general human social question of existence and so on. Which is why Freud obviously is seen as a world historical thinker and not merely a psychologist, and why psychoanalysis is capable of, reintroducing a philosophy. According to some, reintroducing in the history of thought and morality. According to some, psychoanalysis is reintroducing, if you like, a life ethic, for which its connection to Nietzscheanism is very important, or its ambivalent connection to Nietzscheanism is important, you see. Because Freud is doing something quite similar, right? He's writing texts about the condition of humanity. He's writing texts about the condition of civilization as such. Yeah. So in that sense, you can see from Holtzkamp's point of view, Holtzkamp's point of view, it's an invitation to doing something similar to Marxism, because it connects this theory of the individual to the social. But ultimately, it becomes a question as to whether that theory of psychoanalysis is too rigid to have a kind of an adequate compatibility with Marxism. What's his conclusion? His conclusion is that overall, psychoanalysis, in fact, does not facilitate or promote a rapport with the Marxian conception of the individual or of the social. So we can read this passage together and just get a sense of what he's arriving at here. So I'll just read this for you, unless perhaps someone would like to jump in. Perhaps would I have a volunteer who would like to read this passage, at least the one that's highlighted?
Sure, I can read.
Please.
When the various subjective manifestations of failure and denial of reality, and also of managing and coping in the face of unavoidable suppression, become comprehensible for each person in a generalized way through elucidation of the conflict constellations hypostasized as generally human, it is affirmed that the appearance forms change, but the suppression remains. The individual in bourgeois society thus always rediscovers him or herself in psychoanalytic interpretations as a victim of relations. To the extent that the subject comes to recognize and deal with his or her personal or immediate social conflicts, he or she is relieved of the burden of the great, all-embracing conflict, that is, the conflict with the ruling powers and their representatives.
Thank you. Was that Will?
Now, Merrick.
Merrick, thank you so much. I appreciate that. Okay, so what is he getting at here? Well, he's getting at, if you like, in a kind of general sense, he's saying, what is he saying? He's saying that psychoanalysis shelters, and by psychoanalysis he means the way that the individual's symptoms are treated and interpreted as well, both interpreted and treated, in such a way, if you like, that they end up diverted or pacified regarding the Marxist wager. And what's the Marxist wager? Right? What's the Marxist wager? The Marxist wager would be that it would be far too idealist to conclude, even though psychoanalysis has this notion of the individual couched within their sociality, linked from the internal to the external, for which the superego is a great example of that. But ultimately, the question becomes, and this is a question that you see all throughout the dialogues within Freudian Marxism, which is the psychoanalytic cure, right? Or the conception of even how psychoanalysis makes an individual happy. Because again, if Freud can be read as a kind of philosopher, offering a life philosophy. For example, I'm reading an incredible book right now by Philip Reif, an American humanities professor who was married to Susan Sontag, and he wrote a earth-shattering, highly important book called Freud, the Mind of the Moralist in the 1950s. And that's precisely his argument, which is that what psychoanalysis is about is a kind of new stoicism. It's a new life ethic. It's a life ethic for the bourgeoisie, Reif says. Immediately, the question becomes one of class. Because, yes, it's about adjustment to reality. And yes, that question, it must, in some sense, be construed, reality that is, as eternal in some sense, right? So this is the heart of what the Marxist is asking: is what what kind of adaptation is being promoted to the degradations of bourgeois social life. Therefore, if you wish to take an anti-psychoanalytic perspective from a Marxist point of view, your point would be that psychoanalysis adjusts. There's two problems. One, it's for the bourgeoisie. Two, it's not only an adaptation to the status quo, but it's in some sense a kind of radical acceptance and then transcendence without any circumvention or even analysis of the material antagonisms of the world. You may think about what I'm saying and say, well, that's quite hysterical. What would it matter, or what kind of Marxist is going to insist that people never arrive at a state of pleasure or happiness? Yeah. Or rather, you might say, well, maybe the solution then is to democratize the psychoanalytic cure for the plebeians, for the proletarian, for the working class, etc. And that is exactly what Freud himself did for a short period of time in Vienna between the wars, for which Elizabeth Danto's book, Freud's Free Clinics, is essential. It's essential, and I'll put that in our optional reading bucket. It's essential because it answers that second question, which is the class accessibility question, which has plagued psychoanalysis to the present. Lacanians are some of the worst culprits of this problem. Why are they culprits? Because they don't care about the accessibility question in some sense. Maybe they do, but they would never. It's not always necessary or incumbent upon them to prioritize the democratization of psychoanalysis. I mean, there's some exceptions, of course. In South America, they have, as Patricia Garavici has shown, in the lumpen proletariat, the favelas, there's free clinics and things like this. But in the Western countries, the class divide is very pronounced, especially in America, which makes psychoanalysis, frankly, out of touch, and a bourgeois life ethic, if you like. So this is something for us to keep in mind. Moreover, on this slide, and I'd like to see if somebody else would be willing to read the highlighted part, Holtzkampf is saying basically that, yes, social antagonisms from the Freudian both method of interpreting them as well as the arrival of how they're resolved end up psychologizing, right? So they obscure social antagonisms. So I wish to say that what he's basically saying is kind of that psychoanalysis participates in the justification of bourgeois status quo domination, and therefore a Marxist psychology must be one that would avoid. So it's an ethical question he's bringing to bear, an ethical question, which is not hysterically saying, oh, well, forget psychoanalysis to court. He's not saying that, I feel, right? He's saying that psychoanalysis is necessary. He's saying, I see why Marxists must tether with Freud, but nonetheless, these problems remain. So could somebody perhaps read the highlighted part? Anybody can.
I can read it.
Please.
In this connection, it also becomes clear that psychoanalysis can, on the basis of its specific categorical presuppositions, do nothing but psychologize societal class antagonisms as an expression of collective neuroticism. And it has always done this wherever it has dealt with such problems, beginning with Freud's idea that in the October Revolution, the instinctual restrictions necessitated by society and the aggressive tendencies arising from them were redirected outward as hostility of the poor against the rich, of the formerly powerless against the earlier holders of power.
Okay. Here we're introduced to the subtlety of reading methods. Yeah. Freud writes about Marxism very seldomly, right? Freud, you see, you have to have a historical materialist reading of how to read the concepts generated by Freud, for which, again, to repeat, I claim Rosichner helps us the most. Because his method of subversively locating Freud's imminent critique of bourgeois society and of the bourgeois conception of subjectivity, that you'll see when you read Rosichner for next week and for the rest of our course, you'll see the very important method that he brings. And somebody should write about Rosichner's method. It's very important, which we're going to talk about next week as well. Because, yes, look at another optional text, which I will mention and I will share in the optional reading. Freud's Invention of Superego by Etienne Balibar, the French Marxist philosopher. In this incredible essay, Balibar shows that Freud was haunted by the success of 1917. What is the success of 1917? Well, the world historical event of the modern proletarian revolution in Russia, for which Vienna was sitting next door to this experience, for which all of the Bolsheviks were frequenting many of the same cafes as Freud was. So it was inescapable. This event led to the possibility that the same thing could happen by the working class within Germany, for which they tried and they failed. Well, Balibar shows in this incredible essay, which I recommend that you look at sometime in the future if you haven't seen it, that Freud was pressured by liberals, especially the jurist Hans Kelsen, to come up with an account of the way that the external law of society mediates the ego. And this, he says, is the invention of Freud's concept of superego. So you see, the argument Balibar makes is that even in the invention of superego, the shadow of communism was influencing. Why? Because the pressure that the liberal establishment intellectuals were putting on Freud was, is your account of the law an antinomian one? Where is the law's normativity functioning as a regulation? So the argument Balibar makes is that, yes, actually, you can see that housed within Freud's own intellectual endeavors is the question of the Marxist proposal itself, right? And what is the Marxist proposal? I'm saying here that by Marxist proposal, it's the notion that bourgeois society is inadequate and must be transcended and overcome, for which when we see what Wilhelm Reich will say about that, what we find in Reich, if you like, is the antithesis to everything that Holtzkampf is trying to put onto psychoanalysis writ large, right? Which is Wilhelm Reich is going to say that actually we can make, okay, Reich makes the compatibility, what I wish to call the compatibilitist thesis, that there's a fundamental compatibility between Marxism and Freudianism, and it's undeniable, right? So let us consider Wilhelm Reich's piece. First and foremost, the thesis that Holtzkampf put forward about the question of what the Marxist theory of the subject is. Well, the Marxist theory of the subject you could summarize as this second point here, which is that social being determines the development of the subject's flourishing capacity, consciousness ultimately. What Freud offers is a kind of highly sophisticated scientific advancement upon Marx's wager, right? Kind of pushes the fundamental theses on Feuerbach, for which Marx draws out his theory of the subject further. So therefore, there's really no question about the compatibility of psychoanalysis and Marxism. And moreover, Freud's concepts must be read as highly conditioned on the immanent class dynamics of bourgeois society, which means that reaction formations that develop, symptom formations that develop, the Oedipus complex and its possible overcoming are all experienced differently based on your position within bourgeois society. And that presupposition, it must inform the psychoanalyst as well, right? And of course, it informed Wilhelm Reich, which is why he did drive around in a bus offering free sex therapy to the proletariat after the First World War, right? It's also why in his work, Mass Psychology of Fascism, we find an analysis of fascism, which is coming out of a certain understanding of a unique type of repression that the bourgeois family is facilitating. So much so that, yes, Wilhelm Reich will insist that the Oedipus complex will historically wither if the bourgeois family withers. In that sense, you would have to ask, would Freud agree with such a proposal? Well, I don't think Freud has ever really quite answered that question, but nonetheless, Reich is insistent upon it. Okay. Why is psychoanalysis a dialectical understanding of the psyche? Well, it's dialectical precisely because of the way that the contradictions of bourgeois social life embed themselves within the psyche and produce the number one reason why Freud puts such a big emphasis and onus on ambivalence, right? For which every psychoanalytic theoretician will have to come up with some account of the way that ambivalence functions. We will see when we look at group psychology that the ambivalence of love and hate, right, is an example of a dialectic, what he calls a unity of opposites. That's a very important Hegelian conception. And so all of the Freudian concepts, the ego ideal, the ideal ego, like have this conception of the dialectic embedded within them. And that, in fact, moreover, it's necessary to see that the reason that they are split and that they have this dialectic is related to the way that the social antagonisms affect the neurosis of the individual, right? Therefore, when Deleuze and Guattari lean on Wilhelm Reich in the very opening of Anti-Oedipus, precisely because he's the Freudian who's the least idealist and the most materialist. What do they mean by materialist? They simply mean that he's the Freudian who identifies this logic of the external social factors as most determinative on the inner psychic splits of the subject and the fragmentations of the subject, right? So Deleuze and Guattari are close admirers and close readers of Wilhelm Reich, and he is the kind of, the OG, the godfather of making this kind of synthesis possible. And you could say that his Hegelianism is kind of half-rate or antiquated or something like this. Well, what does he say about the dialectic? He says about the dialectic that, in fact, he's a classical Marxist. He says that the negation of the negation is only realizable by the proletariat. Because only the proletariat can harbor the truths of the dialectic, insofar as the dialectic is the eventual disintegration of the contradictions of bourgeois society. So based on the class system, proletariat has a unique access point. In that sense, I wish to say he's a worldview Marxist. These days, worldview Marxism has a kind of receives a lot of suspicion. These days, people say it's not immediately evident, based on the contradictions and antagonisms of our social life, that capitalism produces a proletariat in the same way that it did in the industrial era of capitalism. So, by the way, on our last session together, we will look precisely at that theory through looking at what I'm calling the consumer capitalist superego. Because I wish to say that Marxists make an account beyond worldview Marxism. They say, like Adorno would say, well, Adorno would say that the social antagonisms don't produce this privileged, that the working class does not have some privileged access to the dialectic, as Wilhelm Reich is wishing to say. If that's true, then we need to then reinvent our understanding of what a proletariat is or isn't. Right? So, from Reich, there are implications. There is an implied utopianism. There is, in his unification, in his understanding of what proletarian experience is, for which is not an it is an empirical utopianism, in the sense that, as a psychoanalyst, he's treating the working class. He's identifying symptoms which are unique and which are imposed upon them by ruling class, etc. You see? So therefore, there's an implied coherence of class relations that are determinative, that are locatable and traceable back to those contradictions. The big question is, after the Second World War to now, does such a coherence persist? That's a question for us to wrestle with, right? Moreover, there is an implied utopianism in the sense that, yes, bourgeois society can be overcome, right? This is established. Remember, this book that we're talking about here, Sexpol, were lectures given in Soviet Union in many cases. So the mode of address of Wilhelm Reich is to the communist society that is generating at the time. That's very important to recognize. He was invited to give lectures in the Soviet Union on these matters, right? Now, I've already mentioned the connection to Bolshevism, which we can talk about in the future as well. But suffice it to say, this is what I wish to say regarding Reich. And I want to pause and just gather thoughts and questions before I turn to, before I introduce Wilfred Bion. Did anybody find that this reading of Reich struck them as quite pertinent? When you were reading Reich, did you resonate with Reich? for those of you that read Reich? Were you thinking to yourself, wow, this is sound? Or were you feeling more like questionable or critical? I don't know if anyone's had a chance to read what I asked to read.
I'll jump to it because I've kind of
Please.
worked with Reich before. Yeah.
Please.
The thing I find interesting about Reich, and this is just across his work in general, is this tendency of dealing with like sexual liberation. And in one of his essays, and it's not from the text that we read, but the very end of character analysis, he has this essay on what he calls the emotional plague. And I find myself fascinated by it in the sense in which it kind of recalls to me the idea of like the Freudian death drive, but it's not the Freudian death drive at all. But the idea of like character rigidity and whatnot, all these things that, at least from what I can tell, are his understanding of dealing with a repressed bourgeois society that really regulates the way in which the flows ultimately what would be organ can flow. It sounds very like Deleuze and Guattari to me in the sense, though of course Deleuze and Guattari have their own issues with the vitalism and mechanism debate that like Reich is ultimately caught up in. And so what I find interesting here is just these attempts at basically like allowing the flow of organ, how that would influence a lot of his later work, but also how it gets represented in texts like the mass psychology of fascism, where a lot of fascism is very tied up to sexual rituals, for example, was one of the example. Like I think he talks pretty explicitly about religion and magics and the occult playing a role. And you know, I find that's fascinating in a contemporary context because you still see that in far right and fascist movements. But so I think he has a very striking account, not so much of like you know, like a positive solution to the question of oppression, but in describing the systems of oppression and describing the ways in which people get caught up in stuff like fascism specifically. Now, where I find myself kind of questioning Reich again would be the question of I'll put it in Freudian Lacanian terms because ultimately that's kind of my position, that he has a very clean and neatly functionalist vision of what an integrated human being is. Something that, for example, like in his, and this is why like the emotional plague is not the death drive. Like the emotional plague for Reich is this disturbance of what otherwise would be like a healthy human being. Like you took this monkey and wrecked it completely. Whereas for Freud, this is a fundamental element of this, right? Like it's not just like this tendency towards returning to the inorganic, but it's also like this almost infinite or like immortal thing that keeps life generating. So the interesting thing here is just that for Freud at that point, and I think Julie Roche has a lot to say about this, but there's this negative turn in Freud where there's this negative that cannot be eliminated, and so I can see why Reich got adopted to some extent by like Deleuze and Guattari because of their whole take that like lack is oppressive, and this is very reductive in an account, of course, but that for them Reich seems to be like a psychoanalyst that is trying to step away from the debates of like dealing with like this perpetuation of lack. And dealing with that, like again, facilitating the flows of something, in this case, organ for him, and that's exactly why it doesn't mesh blend with like Freud and Lacan per se, because Freud and Lacan do emphasize some element of lack or fundamental failure that is constitutive of this psychoanalytic subject. And so I just find it really pertinent here. Like this is ultimately like what will amount to what can a prescription for a like a positive project of politics look like, right? Or even whether there's a positive project for politics. So of course, Reich would be pretty utopian in many respects, and I think he shares that a lot with the Frankfurt School to some extent. But the more I see like Freudio-Lacanianism in like and Marxism blend, there's also this sense of like it's not gonna like fix everything, and I think even Marx agrees with that to some extent, right? Like you're or even folks like now, like you're still dealing with some element of like contradictions that are gonna appear even if communism takes on. Yeah.
No, it's good. I mean, one really accessible avenue into understanding the ideas of Wilhelm Reich is, of course, to read someone like William S. Burroughs, because William S. Burroughs was a Reichian. And so what was his method? Yeah. Well, now he's writing after the war mostly. Yeah. Some little before, he's a little older amongst the beat poets and writers. But his argument is Reichian, because he's trying to say that bourgeois society prevents the orgiastic potential for the transcendence of what Reich calls, in a very important concept, character armor. Character armor is one of the most important ideas in the mass psychology of fascism, for which bourgeois society creates a kind of normative mask. It's very Nietzschean in some sense. It's a mask, which is a kind of repressive mask, which we will see in Rosichnère as well, because Rosichnère will say that Freud possesses a acute and sophisticated understanding of the fact that repression is born from class antagonisms, and that in some sense Freud distinguishes and categorizes different modes of subjectivity in distinction and in revolt from normative bourgeois subjectivity. So you have emerged then the Freudian theory of the rebel, the Freudian theory of the anti-fascist, the Freudian theory of the revolutionary. And furthermore, you have the question of, well, if that's true, could psychoanalysis as an art of treatment be considered something that would facilitate the development of a type of subjectivity that would be in opposition to bourgeois normativity? Because the very important point apropos Wilhelm Reich is to historically periodize the type of authority relations, the function of the Oedipus complex within the family at the time that Reich is living and writing. As Marcuse says in his work on the family, he basically says that Reich shows that the repressive bourgeois family for Reich becomes the bulwark, the cornerstone of any question of revolution. So the implied utopianism is linked back ultimately to the way that the bourgeois family and its oppressive Oedipal structure, for which you saw in the essay I had you read, he talks about the historical periodization of Oedipus complex. And what does he say? Again, to repeat, well, communist society will be done with Oedipus, for which he's implying that Oedipus is in fact, and can in fact be construed as a bourgeois patriarchal form. This is the same thesis of Engels in his text on the family. But the difference is that Engels is going back to the matriarchal prehistory of the bourgeois family. You see? And yes, to say again about Burroughs, if you read something like Naked Lunch, it's no surprise that the Supreme Court sought to ban that book during the time of the repressive McCarthyite time, which was an anti-communist time, by the way, in America. Because the argument was that the pleasure principle could only be accessed in repressive bourgeois society through an orgiastic libidinal upsurge. That's what literature must do. Literature must facilitate the orgasm. That's why Wilhelm Reich offered sex clinics. That's why Wilhelm Reich was happy to sleep with his patients. He wrote on the importance of the orgasm. That led him to a cockamamie theory of matter, right, in orgon, and some strange conception that humans lack access to some kind of divine principle, for which William S. Burroughs had an orgon accumulator in his backyard, and all of the literary very interesting literary figures would use it, including people like Kurt Cobain, all the way up to the 1990s. So you see, Wilhelm Reich is the godfather of Freudian Marxism, and his mark is to make Freudian Marxism a highly libertine utopian vision. Even though I have not assigned Herbert Marcuse, I will argue in the last section of this class that Marcuse also is a libertine utopian. There's, of course, nothing wrong with libertine utopianism. I'm not saying that. But as Simone mentions, from the perspective of a Lacanian, there is a problem with it. Going back to their theory of lack, for which Deleuze and Guattari are going to be very critical, and for which we and you need to decide, where you stand on that issue. That would be a question of this class. Is the libertine orientation still alive today? In what way would it be? I think that's a great question. Okay, if there's not any other questions, I want to move on to Bion briefly. And then,
Hi.
please, go ahead.
I had just clarifying questions. Do other Marxist psychoanalysts agree with this really detailed mapping of the dialectic onto Freudian concept? Is that kind of an accepted way of looking at the internal conflicts that is a dialectical method or a dialectical process? Is that in general accepted? Then I had two.
Yeah, okay, go. Okay, sorry, go on.
Yeah, and they're all on the same vein. What was the split with Freud? Was it around sex? Because it seems Reich really pushed the issue of repressed sexuality to the very extreme. Was that the issue of the split, or was it the transference?
It was a
issue of
transference.
something? Okay. And then how did the other, the Frankfurt School relate to Reich? Just briefly.
Okay, great. It was the issue of a transference, which was tied back to his libertine conception of the centrality of the sexual expression and its theory of repression. Absolutely. For which Freud would take the side of Ferenczi over Reich in some sense. There's a great text on this, which I can recommend on the Ferenczi Reich split apropos the question of transference. Regarding the first question,
Please.
yes, I will share that in the optional folder of readings if you'd like to read more about that. It is significant, in fact, to see how Ferenczi would take the transference theory in this notion of a non-relation. The important point he stressed is a non-relation to the analyst hand, whereas Reich is promoting the opposite. Okay, as it pertains to the question of dialectical psychoanalysis, I mean, the answer would be absolutely. He's kind of a pioneer. Okay, there obviously would be other approaches to psychoanalytic thought which would use some conception of dialectics, for which even Lacan, in his immersion into Hegel's phenomenology, I mean, keep in mind the early Lacan, in his conception of mirror stage, in his conception of psychosis, in his theory of the ego, is analyzing this vis-a-vis dialectics through his understanding of Hegel through Kojève. Freud himself, of course, is also grounded in a conception of dialectics, but which is not necessarily tethering with it, certainly not in a Marxist sense. But in his essay on negation, one sees a careful consideration of dialectics, which you could say is more unique to Freud's own approach. Freud is very interesting. Philip Reif mentions this in his book on Freud, in the sense that as a thinker, he doesn't really reference other philosophers or work with other philosophers' ideas too closely. Reif says that Freud kept private, this is very important, Freud kept private his wide reading in literature and philosophy and humanities, and he avoided a lot of philosophers so as to shrug off the anxiety of influence. But you know the real reason why he's not frequently referencing other philosophers is because he wanted to ground psychoanalysis as a science, not as a philosophy, not as a humanistic life ethic. You see? He wanted to keep his transmission of his teachings more in line with a scientific overview. So when he's being dialectical, therefore, we read it as much more original, not as derivative. You see? Much more original. That is actually one way to understand why Freud is so original, because of the pressures he experienced, both because of his Jewish identity at a time of great persecution against Jews. Yeah. The argument there would be that he's seeking scientific legitimacy because his people are not seen as legitimate in some sense. So, yeah, I wish to say that Reich stands alone in some ways as somebody willing to make these connections there, especially the explicit Marxist connections. Okay, so transference I've answered the first question, and then the other one.
Sorry, a specification. So this dialectical method applied to psychoanalysis wasn't really taken up by other authors and expanded or accepted.
No, oh yeah. No, I mean, by other, certainly by people like Frankfurt School and others, but you see many people that would comment on psychoanalysis were not doing so from a clinical agenda point of view. So therefore, you have to understand in the history of psychoanalytic thought, in the history of psychoanalytic thought, the most innovative revolutions regarding how we understand desire, the transference, all of the death drive, and so on, like all of the key Freudian things, those are going to be generated by analysts working with patients. They're not going to be generated by Marxist theoreticians working in the class struggle.
Right.
But that's why Freudian Marxism carves out its own field of concepts, which have a relation to the clinic. And sometimes those authors can be clinicians, but I would say what they're generating is for Marxism. As I said at the very beginning, it's the Marxists that are making this connection. You see? So yes. It's a slight distinction. I think it's important. Now, here's the difference between Frankfurt School and Reich. It's a very important difference. Frankfurt School has a radically different conception of the family. What does Horkheimer and Adorno say about the bourgeois family? Horkheimer and Adorno say that the bourgeois family actually was liberatory. And that there's elements of a bourgeois family experience which the direction of capitalism is eroding and taking away. So it's a different theory of authority that they're working with because of changing conditions than Reich is saying. So therefore, they don't have the same utopian vision. If anything, they're saying, yeah, housed within bourgeois family is all of this very interesting fact that the Oedipus complex can be overcome on the conditions of the bourgeois family. Yes, it promotes a certain repression and character armor and so on. But what's worse is the new conception of the family after the Second World War, consumer capitalist era and so on, which promotes a stunted Oedipus. There's nothing worse than that. Why? Because that produces subjects who cannot rationally locate power and overcome it. But they wish to say that bourgeois family allowed for that, if you like, dialectical process to be overcome. So therefore, Oedipus becomes strained, crisis, pre-Oedipality, that whole debate, which would create a fire with the socialist feminists. Yeah. Because if you say that Oedipus has a liberatory potential, you're kind of saying, well, it's eternal in some sense, which is not what Reich is saying. Reich is saying it's going to be overcome in a communist society. Right? So that's a little bit there regarding, I get into this in my book on the family, you know, where I look at Adorno's very provocative thesis regarding the liberatory aspects of the bourgeois family, which needs to be taken as a kind of double-edged sword, right? Because of these ethical things which I've just mentioned. So I hope that gets a little closer to the distinction between Adorno and Reich, at least.
Yes, actually, I didn't even think about that aspect. I don't know Adorno as much, but yes, thank you very much. That was very clarifying.
Okay, very good, very good, very good, very good. Okay, if there's not any other questions, I'd like to introduce you to Wilfred Bion and his theory of groups. But please, if there's any other comments or anything, please. Okay, very exciting. All right, this is very exciting. Let us move. Okay, Wilfred Bion. Okay, now let me say at the outset that I am no expert on Bion. I am a new convert in some sense. I'm coming to learn about his work, so we will learn together about his thought. And if those of amongst us who may have more reading on Bion, feel free to jump in. He biographically fought in the First World War. He said that, you know, the experience was so traumatic that he basically died as a person in some sense. But whatever happened, he survives the war, and he comes out. There's a very interesting text by Jacques Lacan. Now fast forwarding to the Second World War, because you have to understand that psychoanalysis, and there's a lot written on this, played a crucial role in the Second World War from the standpoint of a theory of groups, precisely. So when we talk about Freud's group psychology, we're talking about it in two resonances, two primary resonances that's important to flag. The first is war, and the second is revolution. War and revolution. Freud is encouraged to write his text, which we're going to look at next week, based on the reactionary theory of bourgeois intellectuals about the proletariat in revolt in the late 19th century, for which Gustave Le Bon is a bourgeois, the bourgeois intellectual, who's basically saying, trying to give an account of in his book on the crowd and the masses in revolt, he's trying to basically say that we need to do all that we can as social scientists to prevent these unruly plebeian revolts, which, of course, at that time, since the Paris Commune up to the Bolshevik Revolution, the question of the masses in revolt was a true question of the social stability of the social order, right? It's a serious question. I mean, today, after Burroughs's, because, you know, when Deleuze wrote his book on the control societies, he got the idea from William S. Burroughs, precisely because now we see that even mass revolts can be quelled, but not during the time of Freud and Le Bon, right? It's a very important distinction. So it's the first revolution, then war. Freud's analysis of traumatic war neuroses, for which you read about in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, plays a formative role in his conception of death drive, obviously, which we can talk about. But Lacan says, in a very bombastic way, as Lacan is very bombastic, in a book called in a lecture called British Psychiatry and the War, he gives perhaps the best compliment that any psychoanalyst has ever given to another psychoanalyst, when he says that the British won the war in part because of Bion's contributions to the psychology of groups. What does that mean? Well, it means that Bion became a consultant to the military and perfected an analysis of converting a negative type of group formation into a more liberatory potential, to maximize the object of the neurosis that he argued would haunt and that the group would share in common, because he wrote about how what he realized was that group activity provided a kind of proof of the non-omnipotent conception of the self. That in his text, Experiences in Groups, he argues in a highly abstract philosophical sense that experiences in groups shows us that there is no such thing as the isolated bourgeois liberated individual, that thought itself emerges out of group activity, and that groups share a common neurosis. Now, that common neurosis takes three predominant forms, which I've listed here for you. The first one he calls the dependent group, we will see is very similar to what Freud calls the artificial group. The artificial group in group psychology. What is the artificial group? It's the church and the army. And Freud says of this group that it is the one which is seeking a preservation of a type of infantile dependency. It's characterized with a type of incapacity to overcome the Oedipal arrangement. And of course, if that's true, does that sound to you as if Freud is making a claim that artificial groups in bourgeois society are at all, this goes back to Rosichnère, are at all capable of being liberatory for the individual? No, on the contrary, they're not at all. And Bion says something very similar. In his critique of religious groups, Bion says they create a repression because they don't allow for genius to be recognized, because they're always assigning they're misassigning because ultimately what he's interested in, which I find very interesting, is a new theory of leadership in groups, in some sense, for which he will ultimately arrive at a primary distinction between what he calls the mystic group and the establishment group. These three can be marked under what he calls the establishment groups. The mystic group is one which handles leadership in a way which is more effective than these. Number two, the fight or flight group is the one that is the group of wartime. Okay. And what Bion tries to do is to shift the natural sadomasochism that will come with a fight or flight group. It's not only wartime, by the way. This is very significant. It's not only wartime. I would say in a sense, this is the predominant group also of capitalism. I mean, if you read the description I put here, I would say this has the tendency to be the next most common type of group formation that we experience in common, for which all of us have been a part of groups structured like this. Because you see, as a biographical point, he goes into analysis with Melanie Klein at a certain point, and that analysis with Klein allows Bion to develop, and he does this during the war, by the way. his analysis with Klein, it allows him to develop the notion that the primary logic of these three groups, of any group, is about the flight from persecutory, the sense of persecution. So these logics have to be mapped onto that Kleinian kind of wager, the Kleinian proposal. And yes, there's these, the schizoid and the depressive thing, which we can discuss as well. But I think the key point I wish to link it to is the flight from persecution as the primary logic by which a group forms. And these three are the ones that are most common, okay? So, you know, what he does is he basically initiates an opportunity for the military unit to begin to find the methods to identify the common neurosis that they share alike. And what that necessitates is making reflective the fact that thought and individualism, this violent individualism of the group, is a product of the collective neurosis of the group, which means that he wants to say that we must shift the neurosis to the interior of the group and use that as the new object, and use that as the object ideal, which we then create from that. So he's in the wartime situation, he's taking number two, the flight or flight group, and he's trying to convert its sadomasochistic structure. And the argument of Lacan is that he was successful in doing this. And this is why Wilfred Bion is a great thinker also for Marxism. Because we will see that this question of leadership, ultimately, I wish to say that the theory of groups revolves around, for Marxism, a theory of leadership. Because Bion even says at one point that Marxism is a superior philosophy precisely because he sees in it a way of the treatment of leadership. And for him, the treatment of leadership falls down to what he calls the capacity for genius, what he calls genius, which is a term I'm not necessarily myself maybe as comfortable with, but as he uses it, it's, you know, he uses it quite positively. And he says that these three groups, formations, which again, we can link back to formations of bourgeois society. Let's keep that in mind. Well, their inadequacy is that they don't allow for genius to emerge or to flourish. Okay. The final group, that what he calls the pairing group, by the way, is simply the sexual group. Okay, that's just a simple way to think of it. And the difference with this group is that thought doesn't emerge. He says thought does not emerge. And by the way, we will see in a moment that for Bion, thought can be understood as what psychoanalytic practice is about. That's what he uses a lot of diagrams, but he uses the O, figure of O, and he says that this, if you like, it's a very Kantian notion. It's almost like a noumenal, that psychoanalytic practice drives both the analyst and the analysand to enter into the mystery of thought. And the mystery of thought is only realizable when the individual is capable of seeing. And this is kind of why I think Bion's very compatible with Marxism. When the individual can see that their participation in the noumenal, in the O, is not a result of their own omnipotent subjectivity.
I have a kind of a note, and this is probably best as an in-passing note, but one of the things that I'm noticing about Beyond saying that there's no thought in love, or the pairing couple, is that sounds actually pretty incompatible, at least with Hélène Badier, as far as I understand his idea that, like, the love event or the encounter between the two becomes something that is productive for thought. So just something that got my attention about that description.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. I mean, the mystic group is the one, you see, because these establishment groups, these three, in some sense, they keep the O, they keep the mystery far afield. And in that sense, they're not adequate precisely for psychoanalytic reasons, because they perpetuate in different ways, they perpetuate a kind of repression. The pairing group doesn't access to the O, it doesn't give access to new thought, it would be interesting to analyze that in relationship to Alain Badiou's theory on the two, for which it is Lacan's Lacan's treatment of Heideggerian ontology ultimately that is being disputed, and it's a very complex question about the theory of the two in Badiou, for which beyond, because you see, in an important sense, I wish to say here on this next slide, you'll see he makes a distinction in groups between sensuous and non-sensuous, right? And in this sense, in a highly rationalist way, these three groups, okay, they may solve the sensuous, but they don't grant access to the non-sensuous noumenal. And so the mystic group has a better proximity to the non-sensuous mystery. So it's a type of monistic spiritual theory, which again, I'm a recent Bionian here. Okay, so I'm still working through it. Again, to repeat, thought is always distinct from any conception of omnipotence, which makes Bion actually very compatible with Lacan's warning against people like Alfred Adler and the ego psychologists, whose whole methodology, right, is the reaffirmation of the omnipotent ego, right? The reaffirmation of a strengthened ego. In some sense, Bion would be, as Lacan would see that as restrictive, ultimately, as producing a subject that would be re-entrenching a certain aggressivity, right? Not capable of overcoming, not capable of entering into thought. As I mentioned before, the logic of groups from his Kleinian baseline perspective is that groups help us alleviate feelings of persecution. That's the primary function, right? And that in wartime, the fight or flight group, which, I mean, again, it's quite, I think, a great essay could be written about why the fight or flight structure appears both within wartime, but also, let's say, perhaps even within the, I don't know, within Wall Street in some sense, right? It would be an interesting analysis, right? Or you might say that the corporation is structured more on a dependent group. You see immediately that the dependent group could allow us to develop a theory of a type of social institutional paternalism. And then you would then have to then ask, what type of institutional affiliations do you possess, which may resemble the dependent group? I think some very useful reflections could come from asking those questions. So I will stop there and leave you with this nice image of the skydiving, which I think connects to the notion of mysticism. And I don't even know what time it is, but I feel like we're we're at a good point to kind of stop my lecture and, I don't know, maybe open it up.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
Yes.
Please.
So what do you think the lessons of Beyonds are for Marxism and any revolutionary practice which would have to be based on solidarity and coming together as people?
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Well,
what would you say?
let's talk about what our comrades think from endnotes here. Thank you, Simon. So what they say, which is useful, they say that Beyond helps Marxists situate themselves around the notion of an analysis of what's new in thought, what's new in the class struggle. Therefore, Beyond helps us read and locate newness. Based on what I've given you their overview there, he helps us with how to think, the preconditions of what groups think better than other groups, because those three groups, they don't think well as Beyond defines thinking. So that would be number one, which I think is true and valuable. My second thought would be that he gives us a sort of suggestion regarding the question of leadership in a group, which would be a warning about how socialist and communist groups not replicate those three, which would be a warning regarding how a socialist group, whether that be a study group, whether that be a sectarian group, whether that be a party, keep that group in relationship to the O, or to the mystery, to the trepidation of that openness, right? So it's he kind of wants to say that a group can produce, if a group can produce new thinking, right, that opens up a certain infinite, I don't know, horizon of possibility to study society, to treat social antagonisms in a non-rigid way, well, a non-reductive way. I wish to say also it's a kind of pragmatism with a small p, because I think also that, well, Marxism needs a healthy, Marxism needs a kind of method by which, by which the class struggle is discerned. And so endnotes gives us some suggestions there. And they want to say that Beyond is a great teacher. And that furthermore, Marx himself was a great Beyondian in that sense, because Marx he didn't learn from philosophers. He learned from the evolution of the struggle, for which, like, that's how he would calibrate his changing of his idea of the state, for example, in the Paris Commune, right? So I hope that gets at it. It's a kind of small p pragmatism, I wish to say. But I wonder what others think about. Is this the first time you've learned of Wilfred Beyond by chance? It is, yeah. He's a very fascinating figure to me. I think it's very much worth looking at. I mean, the question of the mystic is interesting, because he's saying that Marxism should also be couched as similar to like radical Islamic Sufi groups, or even dissident sectarian Christian groups, right? So there's a certain, and those groups are superior because they allow a kind of break. And we'll see this with Rosichnère as well, that the Rosichnère says that you have to read Freud's group psychology as proposing a break from bourgeois normativity, that Freud has a theory of the revolutionary group. Even though he doesn't call it a revolutionary group, there is implicit a theory of the revolutionary group in Freud. So again, you know, we're going to close soon, but when you read Rosichnère, you'll see, and it's up to you if you're convinced of what he does, but Endnote says that Bion has an individualist theory of genius, which I don't really, I think they're wrong about that. I think actually Bion is much, I could put in the optional readings, by the way, Fred Moten's essay called The Mystic Group, which is his analysis. Fred Moten is the great Black radical thinker. He has an essay on Bion, which I'll share with you. So, unless there's any final thoughts or questions, I think we will wrap soon.
Sorry, I do have one again. Okay, can you elaborate a little bit on the concept of the mystic in Beyond, not in Fred Moten, but
Yeah,
in
sure.
Beyond? What you know, mystic is such a loaded term, and what does it mean with that? And also, you know, what are the implications for a class struggle or Marxist revolutionary struggle with the concept of a leader, right? And which is you know, it's been so much has been discussed, and there's so many different approaches to what quote unquote leadership is, and how would that function in class struggle.
Yeah, this is something we're going to look at. Is the leader both to be thought of as a figure who has made a kind of decision on Marxism? If you like, is the question of leadership a voluntarist theory, for which, if you have a Marxist philosopher such as Lukács, and you look at his biography, it's quite evident that there is a type of Kierkegaardian or even Pascalian notion of the wager of the revolutionary, that the revolutionary is a figure who decides, converts, commits. I mean, even Sartre says the same thing in his Marxist phase, which is that Marxist revolutionaries, what he says, enter into a state of a constant and what he calls permanent conversion. Permanent conversion because it's very difficult to be committed to revolution in our society. You face shame, you face ostracization, you need a group, you need a community, and so on. So what does it mean to convene people who have made that voluntarist decision? In some sense, it means something different than what Reich is trying to say that it means, because for Reich, proletarian is already an objective class by virtue of the division of labor. So the proletariat can be kind of located vis-a-vis class formation that's already given. I think in this post-revolutionary times that we live in, it's a different arrangement. There is a voluntarist conception there. So there's that issue. But the mystic group, to answer that question, is basically a group that is distinct from what he calls the establishment group. I've given you the three overviews: the pairing, the dependent, and the fight or flight. It's different than those because it orients the group around a more democratic conception of genius. And genius is simply the capacity to enter into thought. Genius is when a group is able to connect to the noumenal, to the mystery of its own production. In some sense, genius for Bion is like when a group conquers its neurosis. And why Lacan said that Bion was so important for the British is because the British performed well because they have transcended the neurosis of the group. They've made, one of the things that Bion did was he insisted every day there be a parade. Very interesting idea, that the group must have a performance for itself so that all of its members are reminded of the unity of its own parts working together. So he put a big onus on that, of externalizing the question. And so he would say when the group would turn to convert the identification with him as a leader, Bion would have a certain tactic of pushing away from that. Because when the group did that, they were falling back into the structure of the establishment groups. That's not how the mystic group is to be structured. So that's how it's a different conception of leadership. It's in some sense a conception of leadership which is if you like, hostile to the conception of leader as we normally understand it. I don't know if that makes sense. I mean, it's a very speculative notion, this notion of mystic group. Why would he use the term mystic? Well, he's using it because in his psychoanalytic practice, he's trying to answer these big philosophical questions of, like, you know, how does thought emerge? What is the nature of coming into the absolute? So Bion has a theory of the absolute as that which is touching on the unknown. So he'll say, like, for example, there's a great, by the way, secondary book on Bion, which is very accessible. If some of these things I'm saying are confusing to you, I'm going to put it in the optional reading. You can read this. It's a very good introduction to his work. But this is the level of clear grandiosity that he's working with, right? Which is very different than a philosopher. When a philosopher says, I want to say what the absolute is very different because they're not tying it back to the relationship between analyst and analyst end. But that's what Bion is doing. So in that sense, his stuff is super practical. I mean, it's so practical that he would use this concept of the grid to map how thought emerges, almost like a chessboard. And then he would then diagram impediments to the access of the noumenal. And he even gives a simple example of what the noumenal is when you are faced with a problem which both the analyst and the analysand in the therapeutic exchange don't know the answer to. They're working with the O. That is the introduction of what he calls the O. The analysand feels shame recurring. That's a touching on the O. This, you could say the O is the same as the Lacanian real. From that, he calls that the mystic. It is therefore yeah, I mean, it's basically the unknown. I mean, it's a very Kantian notion, I would say.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Very
Yeah, you're
clear.
welcome. Yeah, I'm still learning Bion, but I mean, I hope these remarks have at least made you more interested in researching him. Yeah, because he's quite exceptional thinker. Okay, my friends. Next time we will focus on the readings. Would you like me to remind you of the readings now? What they are? Would that be helpful? Okay. Okay, so let me share my screen so you are aware. Give me 1 second.
And Daniel, I had to request for access from another email, my Gmail account. I don't know if
Oh, okay. Okay, I will make sure that I do that. Let me just
do it later.
Okay, cool. Yeah. Okay. Can you all see that? Yeah. Okay. So here they are. So what is Freudian Marxism? That's today. Go there. You reference the syllabus to see the readings from today. For next week, we are here where you will have access to Freud's mass psychology text and Rosichnier's text, for which the page numbers are listed in the syllabus. That's for next week. Okay. For week 3, we have this one on history, for which these are the 3 texts to read. Okay. And then for the final day, we have these 2, Karatani and Stiegler. So, yes, I have these requests, which I'm going to approve right now. And I think that covers it, my friends. Thank you all so much. Perplexed one. That's a great email. Perplexed one. I like that.
That's me.
Yes.
Is the recording gonna be available before next week? Do you know anything?
Yeah, there will be. Yeah, it should be ready tomorrow.
Okay,
Ready
great.
tomorrow. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
And I might have requested a couple of times there. Sorry about that.
Oh, no worries. My
bad.
Yeah.
And also, could we look at the slides again, or no? And we won't.
Yeah. I will put them in the folder.
Okay, thank you. That would be helpful. That would be helpful as well. Thank you.
Please ask any question you have at any time. I know this is like high level stuff, and I get very passionate about these things, as you can tell. So don't feel shy to just like say, I don't understand what you're saying. Can you please repeat that? Please, at any time you can do that. Or of course, you can also email me, and I'm happy to meet with you during the course of this seminar. We can do a Zoom if you wish, anything like that. It's totally chill with me.
Thank you.
Just want to thank you again, and I really look
Thank
forward.
you so much.
Yeah, I look forward to next week.
Yeah.
Cool.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, bye for now.
Bye.
Bye.